Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. Now I've had this Typhus model in my pile of shame for quite a while from a Combat Patrol box that I bought probably over a year ago. A lot of noise since the price drops. That Typhus is an amazing character in games, so I thought let's get him painted up. Got some games coming up and let's, try it out. Now I'm starting off how I start off all of my Death Guard, or pretty much most of my Death Guard. Black spray, lead belcher over the top, and you'll see later why I like to do my models from a metallic base coat. Doing the Retributor armour trim all around the model first for those nice brass areas, and then moving on to the Death Guard green. Now with some of these base coats, what I'm trying to do is show the damage and the metal colour from underneath. So you look on his chest plate there, there's like a bullet hole, there's some cracked armour, and that crosses over all of his armour panels. And I don't want to cover up every last piece of metal because it'll show through and then show that kind of battle damage and aged armour. So if you look around as I'm painting, I'm leaving quite a lot of the metal showing through. Now this stage is something you wouldn't want to do that on, so painting the skulls, because obviously skulls aren't made of metal, so a real good layer of that bone colour on the skulls, the spikes, all those kind of things all over the model, including like the vents coming out of his backpack. So you've got to kind of paint in two different ways. Moving on to the cloth, obviously again here, good coats, a couple of thin coats across here to make sure none of that metallic showing. And I've used purple because that's kind of my Death Guard army colour scheme, and it's not too far away from the official Typhus scheme of that kind of reddy purple that he has. Now moving on to like a dark blue for these flies, and there's quite a lot of these sort of big fat blue bottles all over the smoke, and actually probably would have been better to paint these pieces separate from the model, but that's not something I've ever really done. I find it quite awkward and fiddly, so I've glued it together and made it awkward and fiddly. I do have a piece of equipment on the way though that's going to help me paint in sub-components, and I'll give it a go in a later video. Now onto the smoke. I've used this cold ground, so the cobblestones and the bases. I'm not only going to go through the base because there's a video on the channel for that, but I'm putting that in between all the flies into the smoke, being quite careful, but it doesn't overly matter if some of the metallic shows through in these kind of stages. Now moving on to some details on his chest plate, just picked a black to do the piping around his chest, and there are two sets of piping. One is kind of very industrial looking, and the second one, the real sort of fleshy looking pieces around there. Now for the fleshy bits, I've taken that Rakkar flesh, which is a colour I use on a lot of my armies, tends to be for the demonic pieces, so I'm also painting the Nurgling that's kind of hugging him with that as well. Now onto his scythe, obviously a very typical Nurgly weapon. A couple of different browns being used on here. One is kind of the cam pale brown, as is on here, onto the sort of wrapped leather, and also onto the pouches that are around his back. He has actually got some pouches on him. Very, very small though. Probably a bit of an afterthought to cover up a moulding line from workshop, but it's not something you really see on the model very often. So yeah, around the back there are some pouches. And then up onto the haft of the weapon, the actual original wooden haft, in a kind of beige brown colour just to represent the wood. Now you don't have to use those exact colours, these are just kind of what I've used for my army, and colours that I've used across quite a lot of the models. But I find using the same colour scheme across most of the models with some little variances works well to tie the models together. Rather obvious statement there really. Deep yellow into the pustuly bits, not too many of those on this model to be honest, but I did do the base again later on with the deep yellow after I've done the eyes here. You'll see yellow into the eyes on Typhus himself and onto the Nurgling. Before we go into this Vallejo sepia game wash now, if you watch the channel, I use this a lot. This is a sort of rather dirty mucky ink wash that Vallejo do. If you watch recent videos, you'll also know that I occasionally use the Games Workshop sepia wash. Games Workshop one leaves a lot less dirty residue and probably requires less work after the fact. So if you're wanting to kind of almost be finished at this point, you probably want to use a Games Workshop sepia wash, and you could pretty much have the model done at this stage. But I've used the Vallejo one, puts a lot of dirt on it, so you do need to go back over the armour. And all I'm doing here is taking the exact same colours I've used for the rest of the model so far, and really putting it on in a slightly more watered down format. Now I use a wet palette, so this paint is coming straight off that wet palette, and it's quite thin at this point. And I'm really sort of halfway between a wash and a top coat over here, leaving the streaks and the manky bits showing through the paint. And you also see not going right into the edges. So I'm leaving this real dirty wash layer in the edges of the armour, in the sunken gaps and cracks where I've left the metallic showing through. So we're not making the armour clean. This is quite a dirty way of painting. And the rest of the colours here you can see are just edge highlighting, so we're not doing a full paint of the area, we're just putting it on the very raised edges along the leather strapping there, along the wood, again using the same colours we've already used, and we're really only doing it at the very, very edges. So it's only the armour that we go over literally every flat panel at this point. The rest of it, edge of the brush, putting it onto again, the raised edges, because we want those kind of dirty parts sinking in. So if you wanted to not do this edge highlight stage and whatever, then you would just use a cleaner looking wash, but I'm trying to make him look like the rest of my army, and that's how we've done the rest of the army. Now the Nurgling you treat a bit more like the armour, so taking that Rakarth flesh colour, and you are again a thin layer across all the flesh. If you actually want a bit more of a detailed thing about how I do Nurglings or whatever, my Great Unclean One video from last week, painting him up, obviously I've painted this Nurgling in the same sort of style that I did the Great Unclean One, so the idea is he'll match a little bit with there. And then so far I've done sort of 2 different ways of painting the demons, Great Unclean One and this little guy here in one kind of scheme, and I have a very green orientated Plague Bearer thing for my army as well, so painting things similar but not identical right across the army. Again, going into the helmet, same colours, nothing different. Going along to the bone, as you can see here, just putting it on the very raised edges. Didn't get a lot of good footage of painting the bone for some reason. The camera messed up a little bit, so you're just seeing this little one here. But it's the same technique going around the rest of the model. Same colours, working them through there. And I find that really, one, you're buying a lot less paint to your army, doing a dirty wash than using the same paints again. It's a little bit simpler to work as well. Now I did decide to do a couple of actual different highlights. So I'm taking an off-white here, which again is still not a pure white, but just doing some edge highlighting on that helmet with an off-white colour just to separate it from the bone colour, because so far I've done the helmet in bone and it did look very, very similar, because obviously it would. Taking an off-white to that stage higher. Taking a Nurgling green here just to do some edge highlighting on these armour panels, because again, bit of a character, so why not try something different? And some of the ridges on this armour are quite significant, so I thought it was worth taking the next level up from the Death Guard green and just doing some gentle edge highlighting around some of the armour panels around the model, and I think it just makes that little extra level of standing out than the rest of the models. Now I've not done anything on this fleshy tube bit so far, so I didn't put any of the Rakarth flesh back down, so I'm putting the Majos purple contrast paint just into, I suppose, the gross bits you'd call them. And then I thought I wasn't quite happy with the helmet, so I took that Majos purple and I've literally just edged around the helmet areas and just dropped some of that purple into the gaps really on that helmet, and it's made it kind of a really weird eerie purpley white. So just something a little bit different to try. Into the Nurgling with his sort of weird intestines that are hanging out with that purple as well, and then taking a Beeltang green shade, dropping that onto the Nurgling flesh. Again, I mentioned before, I'm making him match a little bit the Great Unclean One that I did in last week's video, and it was this green that I used on the Great Unclean One flesh to kind of give him a little bit more of a demonic feel. And this Nurgling is a little bit dirtier looking than the Great Unclean One, but he matches in a little bit. And I'm taking that green as well onto the smoke areas coming out of the pack, so again just a nice wash. I've done nothing with the smoke so far, so yes, I did the grey and then the wash, but I've not put anything back on at all, so no grey on that smoke so far, and just putting that green on mean it's going to be different to the base grey that we did, so looks a bit different there. Nylak oxide onto the brassy bits to make it look a bit more rusty and aged, and then Riser rust, not too heavy, just a gentle dry brush to put some little orangey bits onto the metal. And again, nothing more done on the metal so far than this. It was just that lead belcher spray and then the wash. So these are a couple of little details to make it stand out a little bit. Now you couldn't paint Typhus without using Typhus corrosion, so just a little bit here around where those bullet impacts are on the model, just to put a little bit of visual difference. Again, it is a character model, so going a little bit further than I would necessarily on a normal model. And then it's the paint that every single Death Guard or Nurgle army should use. A bit of Nurgle's rot on these pustuly areas where it's bursting out of his leg. Some of the armour cracks I've put it into where, you imagine the bullet's gone in and his internal sort of fluids are leaking out. And onto the base area where you see I've painted it with that base coat of yellow to make that kind of real manky, Nurgly base. And there we have it, kind of in the colour scheme. Very, very similar to the rest of my army with a lot of similar techniques and similar paints, but with a couple of little differences to make Typhus stand out as a character. Hope you enjoyed that. Like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz, and I'll see you again.